The engine started at 6:12 in the morning, and not a single person in the building could explain why. The sound rolled through the service department like a rumor becoming reality. Technicians stopped what they were doing. Service advisors stepped out from behind their desks. Even customers waiting in the showroom turned toward the open bay doors. For 3 months, the car had been nothing more than an expensive problem, sitting inside Whitmore Luxury Motors. 3 months of diagnostics. 3 months of replacement parts. 3 months of factory consultations, engineering reports, and failed attempts. The vehicle itself was worth more than most houses in the county. The engine inside it had become something even more valuable, a test. Lauren Whitmore heard the commotion from the second floor of the dealership. She was reviewing quarterly reports when one of her managers hurried into her office without knocking. "You need to come downstairs," he said. Lauren immediately stood. The look on his face told her this was not another failed update. Something was different. By the time she reached the service department, a crowd had already formed around the vehicle. Nobody was speaking very loudly. The room carried the strange silence that appears when people witness something they had stopped believing could happen. Lauren stepped closer. The engine was running smoothly, not sputtering, not struggling, running. The idle was clean. The diagnostic monitors showed no active faults. One technician stared at the screen as though expecting the numbers to change at any moment. They did not. Lauren looked around the bay. "Who fixed it?" Nobody answered immediately. Several employees exchanged glances. Finally, a senior technician cleared his throat. "The single dad." Lauren frowned. What single dad? Mason Reed. The name meant nothing to some people standing there. To others, it sounded vaguely familiar. A few employees remembered seeing him around town. He owned a small garage on the edge of the city. He repaired pickup trucks, family sedans, and work vehicles. Nothing about him suggested he should have succeeded where factory engineers and master technicians had failed. Lauren looked toward the office overlooking the service bays. Where is he now? Another silence followed. Then someone pointed toward the parking lot. Through the glass, a man in a faded work jacket was walking toward an older pickup truck. No celebration, no audience, no speech. He carried a metal toolbox in one hand and moved with the calm pace of someone finishing an ordinary day. Lauren watched him for a long moment. Behind her, the engine continued running perfectly. Ahead of her, the man responsible for it was already leaving. And for the first time in 3 months, everyone inside the dealership wanted the answer to the same question. How had he done it? 3 months earlier, the vehicle arrived at Whitmore Luxury Motors on the back of an enclosed transport trailer. Even before the doors opened, people in the dealership were talking about it. The car belonged to a private collector whose collection was known throughout the region. More importantly, the collector was one of Lauren Whitmore's largest clients. Keeping his trust mattered. Losing it was not an option. At first, the problem appeared manageable. The engine would start briefly, run unevenly, then shut down without warning. Initial diagnostics suggested a complex electronic issue. The dealership's senior technicians began testing immediately. Days turned into weeks. Components were inspected, replaced, recalibrated, and tested again. Nothing worked. The collector remained patient through the first month, less patient through the second. By the beginning of the third month, pressure had reached every level of the dealership. Lauren sat through weekly update meetings that never seemed to produce progress. Every report sounded similar. New theories, new tests, new expenses, the same result. One afternoon, the lead service manager stood before Lauren and several department heads with a stack of technical reports in his hands. "We have consulted factory engineers, independent specialists, and 2 master technicians from out of state, he said. Nobody has identified the root cause. Lauren looked at the reports without speaking. The room remained silent. Finally, she asked the question everyone wanted answered. Can it be fixed? The manager hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. We do not know. Across the following weeks, more specialists arrived. Some spent hours studying data logs. Others focused on mechanical systems. One expert claimed he had seen a similar failure years earlier. His solution failed within a day. Another recommended replacing major components entirely. The result was exactly the same. Employees began avoiding conversations about the vehicle altogether. Nobody wanted responsibility for another unsuccessful attempt. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of town, Mason Reed knew nothing about the growing frustration inside Whitmore Luxury Motors. His days followed a simpler routine. He opened Reed Automotive before sunrise, worked on customer vehicles throughout the day, and returned home each evening to his daughter Emma. Their small house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Life there moved at a different pace. One evening, Emma sat at the kitchen table coloring while Mason reviewed invoices. "Did you fix everything today?" she asked. Mason smiled. "Not everything." "Why not?" "Because there is always something else waiting tomorrow." Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. She returned to her coloring book while Mason looked through paperwork. Neither of them knew that less than 5 miles away, a problem that had defeated some of the most respected technicians in the industry was slowly moving toward his garage. The first person to mention Mason Reed inside Whitmore Luxury Motors was not an executive, an engineer, or a consultant. It was an older technician named Walter Briggs, who had spent nearly 30 years working around engines. Walter was the kind of mechanic who spoke rarely and observed constantly. During one particularly frustrating meeting, while specialists debated theories that had already failed twice, Walter sat quietly near the back of the room listening. Finally, he cleared his throat. The conversation stopped. "I know somebody who might want to look at it," he said. Several people exchanged glances. The service manager looked up from his notes. "Who?" Walter shrugged. "Mason Reed." The response generated little enthusiasm. One consultant frowned. Another technician looked confused. The service manager searched his memory. The name sounded familiar but unremarkable. "The guy with the small garage near River Street?" someone asked. Walter nodded. A few people laughed softly. Not out of cruelty, out of disbelief. They had already consulted factory engineers and specialists from multiple states. The idea that a local mechanic working from a modest garage could solve what they could not seemed unrealistic. Walter simply folded his arms. "You asked if I knew anyone. I do." The meeting continued. The suggestion was largely ignored. Yet, over the next week, as another round of diagnostics produced nothing useful, the name kept resurfacing. Mason Reed. Eventually, even Lauren Whitmore heard it. At first, she dismissed the idea. Then another specialist failed. Then another. The collector called requesting progress. There was none to report. Frustration continued growing. One evening, Lauren remained in her office long after most employees had gone home. Through the window, she could see the service department below. The vehicle sat exactly where it had been sitting for months. Expensive, silent, unsolved. She opened another report, then another. Every document reached the same conclusion. No confirmed cause, no reliable solution. Her eyes drifted toward a handwritten note someone had attached to a file earlier that day. 3 simple words: "Ask Mason Reed." Across town, Mason locked the doors of his garage and prepared to leave for the evening. The shop was small but organized. Every tool had a place. Every workbench was clean. A customer picked up a truck. Another thanked him for solving a problem 2 other shops had missed. Mason accepted the thanks with a nod and returned to cleaning his workspace. Emma sat nearby, reading a library book while waiting for him to finish. "Are we getting pizza tonight?" she asked. Mason smiled. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether somebody brings me another impossible problem before closing time." Emma laughed. Neither of them realized that before the week ended, the most difficult engine in the city would arrive at the garage door, and everything would begin to change. The vehicle arrived at Reed Automotive on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Unlike the dealership, which had treated the car like a high-profile project, Mason treated it like any other repair order. He listened carefully while the transport driver described the situation, signed the paperwork, and rolled the vehicle into the far service bay. Then he went back to finishing work on a customer's pickup truck before giving the mysterious engine any attention at all. Late that evening, after the final customer left and the garage grew quiet, Mason walked over to the vehicle for the first time. He did not connect diagnostic equipment immediately. He did not begin removing components. Instead, he simply stood beside the car with his hands in his pockets, studying it. The service record sat on a nearby workbench. Hundreds of pages, factory reports, engineering notes, replacement histories, diagnostic results. Mason spent nearly an hour reading before touching a single tool. The next morning, he started the engine. It behaved exactly as described. The idle fluctuated slightly. Sensors reported inconsistent readings. Then, the engine shut down. Mason tried again. Same result. He nodded once and turned the ignition off. Emma arrived after school carrying her backpack and a paperback novel from the library. She found her father sitting beside the vehicle reading through technical documents. "Is that the impossible one?" she asked. Mason smiled. "That is what everyone keeps calling it." Emma walked around the car slowly. "Do you think you can fix it?" Mason considered the question. "I think I can learn something from it." She seemed satisfied with the answer and settled into a chair near the office window. Throughout the next 2 days, Mason continued observing. He listened to the engine. He reviewed historical data. He examined repair records from every specialist who had worked on it. What surprised him was not what they had tested. It was what they had ignored. By Thursday afternoon, he noticed a pattern hidden beneath months of reports. A small inconsistency repeated itself over and over again. Most people would have dismissed it as background noise. Mason did not. He pulled a notebook from a drawer and began writing. Hours passed. The rain returned outside. Service lights reflected across the wet pavement beyond the garage doors. Emma eventually looked up from her homework and noticed something unusual. Her father was smiling. It was a small smile, barely noticeable, but she had seen it before. It appeared whenever he discovered something important. "You found it, did you not?" she asked. Mason closed the notebook. "Maybe." Emma grinned. "That means yes." Mason laughed softly and stood from the workbench. Across town, executives and technicians continued assuming the vehicle was probably headed toward another failure. None of them knew that for the first time in 3 months, someone was finally looking in the right place. By Friday morning, Mason had stopped looking for what was broken. That decision confused anyone who might have been watching, although nobody was. Most technicians approached difficult problems by searching for failed parts. Mason approached them differently. He searched for assumptions. Every report from the dealership rested on the same foundation. Certain systems were assumed to be functioning correctly because they passed standard tests. Certain readings were assumed to be accurate because diagnostic equipment reported them consistently. The longer Mason studied the records, the more those assumptions bothered him. He spent the day repeating tests that dozens of experts had already performed, not because he expected different results, because he wanted to understand how they had reached their conclusions. Late that afternoon, he sat alone beside the vehicle with a notebook full of observations. The garage was quiet. Sunlight stretched across the concrete floor. Outside, traffic moved steadily along River Street. Inside, Mason reviewed the same pages for the fourth time. Then he noticed something, a tiny discrepancy. Not a failure, not an error code. Just a measurement that remained strangely consistent when every related value fluctuated. Most technicians would have ignored it. After all, consistency usually suggested reliability. To Mason, it suggested something else. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the engine for nearly 5 minutes without moving. Emma arrived shortly afterward carrying a paper bag from a local sandwich shop. She placed it on the workbench beside him. "You forgot lunch again." Mason glanced at the clock and smiled. "Looks like I did." Emma looked at the notebook covered in numbers and diagrams. "Did the car tell you its secret yet?" Mason laughed softly. "Not yet. But it is getting close?" He folded the notebook shut. "Maybe." Emma nodded as though that answer confirmed everything. She had learned long ago that whenever her father said maybe, he usually meant yes. Throughout the afternoon, Mason performed several additional inspections. None of them attracted attention. None appeared dramatic. Yet each one pointed toward the same conclusion. The problem was not where everyone had been looking. It was connected to a detail so small that most specialists considered it irrelevant. By evening, Mason finally called the dealership. Lauren Whitmore happened to answer after being transferred through 2 departments. She expected another update explaining why the vehicle remained unsolved. Instead, Mason asked only 3 questions. Each question concerned work performed months earlier. Each question seemed oddly specific. Lauren searched old records and provided the answers. When the call ended, she sat quietly at her desk. For the first time since the vehicle arrived, someone sounded less confused after examining it than before. Meanwhile, Mason returned to the garage floor, looked once more at the silent engine, and began preparing for a very long night. The garage remained lit long after the rest of River Street had gone dark. Outside, the storefronts closed one by one, until only the glow from Reed Automotive remained visible through the rain-speckled windows. Inside, Mason worked without hurry. That was the detail most people misunderstood about him. He was not fast because he rushed. He was fast because he spent less time chasing the wrong answers. The engine sat open beneath bright work lights while pages of notes covered the nearby workbench. Every failed diagnosis from the previous 3 months had led him closer to a conclusion nobody else had considered. Shortly before midnight, Mason performed another test. Then another. The results matched his theory perfectly. He nodded once and reached for a small component resting beside his notebook. It was not expensive. It was not rare. In fact, most technicians would have overlooked it entirely because it appeared to be functioning normally. That was precisely the problem. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Emma briefly appeared at the garage office doorway wrapped in a blanket. She had fallen asleep in the small room behind the shop while waiting for her father. "Are you still working?" she asked quietly. Mason glanced at the clock. "Looks that way." Emma rubbed her eyes. "Did you figure it out?" Mason smiled. "I think so." She smiled back. "I knew you would." A few minutes later, she returned to sleep. completely confident that whatever challenge sat in the service bay would not remain a challenge for much longer. The hours continued passing. Mason reassembled several systems, verified measurements, and repeated every test he considered important. He trusted conclusions only after they survived verification. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, he finally lowered the hood and cleaned his workspace. The garage looked almost exactly as it had the previous evening. No dramatic signs of victory, no piles of discarded parts, no evidence that anything extraordinary had happened. At 5:47, he sat alone on a stool beside the vehicle drinking coffee from a plain paper cup. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The engine remained silent. Mason waited. Then he stood, placed the cup on the workbench, and turned the key. The response was immediate, smooth, stable, consistent. He listened carefully for nearly 5 minutes. Every reading remained exactly where it should be. No irregularities, no warnings, no surprises. Mason shut the engine off, reviewed the data one final time, and completed his paperwork. When the transport driver arrived later that morning, the vehicle was ready. By the time it reached Whitmore Luxury Motors, employees were beginning another day expecting disappointment. Instead, they were about to witness something none of them thought they would ever hear again. The sound of an engine everyone had given up on finally running exactly the way it was meant to. The reaction inside Whitmore Luxury Motors spread faster than any official announcement. By mid-morning, technicians who had spent months working on the vehicle were standing around the service bay reviewing data for themselves. They checked sensor readings. They repeated tests. They verified every system they could think of. The result remained unchanged. The engine performed exactly as it should. One technician shook his head while staring at the diagnostic screen. That cannot be all there was to it. Another technician looked through the service records again. Apparently it was. Nobody seemed embarrassed. Mostly they seemed puzzled. After 3 months of complexity, everyone expected the answer to be complicated. The possibility that the solution had been hiding behind a simple assumption felt almost unfair. Upstairs, Lauren Whitmore sat in her office reviewing the final report Mason had submitted. The document was surprisingly short. No dramatic explanations, no lengthy analysis. Just a clear description of what he had found, why previous tests had missed it, and how the issue had been resolved. She read it twice, then a third time. The more she studied it, the more one realization continued bothering her. Mason had not discovered information unavailable to everyone else. He had simply looked at the problem differently. Later that afternoon, Lauren walked through the service department. Employees were still discussing the repair. Several specialists who had participated earlier in the project admitted they would never have investigated the area Mason focused on. One consultant stared at the report and laughed quietly. "We spent months looking everywhere except the place that mattered." Lauren continued toward the showroom. Through the glass walls, she could see customers browsing vehicles, sales staff conducting appointments, and normal business continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet something had changed. The impossible problem was gone. More importantly, the person responsible had never asked for recognition. Across town, Mason spent the day replacing brakes on a family sedan and diagnosing a transmission issue on an aging pickup truck. The famous vehicle was already gone. The excitement surrounding it barely reached his garage. To him, the repair belonged to yesterday. Emma noticed the difference immediately. "You fixed the impossible one," she said while organizing books in the office. Mason smiled without looking up from his work. "I fixed a car. Everybody keeps calling it impossible. Everybody calls lots of things impossible." Emma considered that for a moment. "Are they usually wrong?" Mason tightened a bolt before answering. Sometimes they just stop looking too soon. That evening, Lauren received a call from the collector, whose vehicle had caused months of frustration. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, she sat quietly at her desk. The client sounded happier than he had in months. Trust had been restored. The crisis was over. Yet Lauren found herself thinking less about the engine and more about the quiet mechanic who had solved it. Because for the first time, she wanted to understand not what Mason Reed had fixed, but who he really was. The following week brought an unusual number of visitors to Reed Automotive. Some arrived because they had heard rumors about the repair. Others came after speaking with technicians from Whitmore Luxury Motors. A few simply wanted to meet the mechanic who had solved a problem that specialists could not. Mason treated every customer exactly the same. Whether someone drove a luxury performance vehicle or a 10-year-old pickup truck made no difference. He listened carefully, asked questions, and focused on the work. The attention surrounding him seemed unable to change that. Lauren Whitmore noticed it immediately during her first visit to the garage. She arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon expecting something larger, something closer to the facilities operated by high-profile consultants and industry experts. Instead, she found a modest building, a clean workspace, and a mechanic helping an elderly customer understand a repair estimate. There were no framed awards on the walls, no marketing displays, no signs celebrating recent accomplishments. Everything about the place felt practical. Lauren waited until the customer left before approaching. Mason looked up from a workbench and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon." "I wanted to thank you personally," Lauren said. Mason set down a wrench. "The car is running well." "Perfectly." "That is good." Lauren almost smiled. After weeks of meetings with consultants eager to explain their expertise, the simplicity of the answer caught her off guard. "You saved an important relationship for the dealership." Mason shrugged lightly. "I fixed a vehicle." Lauren studied him for a moment. The response sounded genuine. He truly seemed uninterested in taking credit. "Do you always downplay what you accomplish?" she asked. Mason considered the question. "The engine does not care who fixes it." For a second, Lauren did not know how to respond. Then she laughed quietly. It was probably the most honest thing anyone had told her all month. Their conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Before leaving, Lauren asked one final question. Why did nobody else find the problem? Mason looked toward the service bay where another customer vehicle waited. Because everyone was looking for something complicated. And you were not? Complicated problems sometimes come from simple mistakes. Lauren nodded slowly. As she walked back toward her vehicle, she realized something important. The repair itself was impressive, but it was no longer the thing she found most remarkable. What stayed with her was the discipline behind it, the patience, the willingness to observe when others rushed to conclusions. Later that evening, Emma sat across from her father at the kitchen table while he reviewed paperwork. "The dealership lady came by today, did she not?" Mason looked up. "How did you know?" Emma smiled. "You only make that face when somebody asks a lot of questions." Mason laughed softly. "Maybe." Emma returned to her homework. Did she finally understand? Mason glanced out the window for a moment before answering. She is starting to. A month later, life at Reed Automotive looked almost exactly the same as it had before the repair. The morning coffee still brewed before sunrise. Customers still arrived with ordinary problems. Mason Reed still spent most of his day under hoods, beside lifts, and behind workbenches. If success had changed anything, it was difficult to see. That was one of the reasons people respected him. He never seemed interested in becoming the center of attention. Meanwhile, Whitmore Luxury Motors continued hearing stories about the mechanic who had solved the problem nobody else could solve. Technicians discussed his repair process. Managers referenced his report during training sessions. Even a few industry publications mentioned the unusual story. Yet Mason remained exactly where he had always been. One Friday afternoon, Lauren Whitmore visited the garage again. This time, she arrived with a proposal. After exchanging greetings, she placed a folder on the workbench. "I would like to offer you a position," she said. Mason glanced at the folder but did not open it. Doing what? Leading a new diagnostic division. Better equipment. Larger projects. More resources than you have here. Mason listened politely. It was a generous offer. Most people would have accepted immediately. Lauren knew that. What she did not know was that Mason had spent years building the life he wanted. He looked around the garage, the familiar tools, the customers who trusted him, the small office where Emma often sat after school. Then he looked back at Lauren. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I'm going to stay here." Lauren was surprised, though not offended. "May I ask why?" Mason smiled slightly. "Because this is enough." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lauren nodded. For the first time, she truly understood. Success was not always about moving higher. Sometimes it was about knowing where you belonged. Before leaving, she extended her hand. Mason shook it. No contracts, no negotiations, just mutual respect. That evening, after the garage closed, Mason and Emma sat together on the front porch of their house, watching the sunset settle over the neighborhood. The air was quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives after a long season finally ends. Emma swung her feet gently from the porch step. "Did the dealership lady come back?" she asked. "She did." "Did she ask more questions?" Mason laughed softly. "A few." Emma smiled. "Did they finally listen to you?" Mason looked toward the fading sunlight and thought about the months of confusion, assumptions and doubt surrounding that engine. Then he shook his head gently. "No." Emma frowned. "No?" Mason smiled. "They listened to the engine." Emma considered that answer for a second before smiling too, and somehow that seemed like the perfect ending.